Welcome to Inside Economics. I'm Mark Sandy, the Chief Economist of Moody's Analytics, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Marisa DiNatale and Cris. Hi, guys.
Hey, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
We had a nice dinner last night. This is we're taping this a little early. We're going to release this podcast, I think, right before New Year's, or was it right after right before New Year's? Yeah. Okay. This is for Christmas, so a little early. We're going to talk about the 2023 economic outlook. So a little bit of an evergreen, so not as time sensitive. But we had a nice dinner last night for one of our retiring colleagues, Sophia Korpetsky. We'll miss Sophia. She's did she say she's been with me for 28 years? Something. I think it was 28 years.
That's what she said. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty amazing career. And she was kind of in the background. She's not like a publicity hound like Marisa is. Marisa's always looking for publicity.
That's me.
Yeah. Yep. Sophia's a very quiet person, but it was really critical to keeping all the trains on the tracks and keeping our work going forward and to cross the finish line. Fair, but I'd say a pretty, reasonably tough taskmaster. You need a little bit of grit and the ability to swing some elbows every once in a while to get stuff done, especially with a bunch of economists. And she did that with great aplomb. So we'll miss her. It was a very nice dinner, and thank you, Sophia, for all you've done for the organization for 28 plus years.
And she's been a great labor market economist too. And
that's right. Didn't she say, Cris, last night she covered on Economic View, where we cover all the releases, the employment report for, I don't know, 23 years or something
like that. And
she told me she's written it for 25 years.
Oh, 25 years.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty amazing. And who's going to cover that report now? Do you know?
Dante
D'Antonio, of course. Yeah. He's always on the podcast on Jobs Friday, so he knows his stuff. So that's good to have Dante.
Yeah, she made us better. Definitely. She was, high standards from quality standpoint. She wouldn't let your writing just go through. So she will definitely be missed.
Very, very nice person, and key to our success for sure. Thank you, Sophia. Okay, we're going to talk about the 2023 outlook. We're also going to add a new feature to the podcast where we're going to answer listener questions. We've been collecting a few. We get them every week. We've kind of tried to weave answers to the questions in the podcast itself, but I think we're going to see how this works, how this goes. We're going to carve those questions out into a part of the podcast and just go through them, and answer people's questions. Because if you have a question, it's very likely others have the same one or a similar one. So, and this means the onus is now back on you, dear listener. You if you have questions, fire away. What's the best way to reach us? Would it be helpeconomy@moodys.com? So that's kind of our help site. So help economy, one word, at Moody's, MOODYS.com, helpeconomy@moodys.com. Just, fire away, send in anything that's bugging you. And when it comes to the economy, I'm sure all kinds of things may be bugging you. When it comes to the economy, financial markets, any of that kind of stuff, fire away, and we'll respond to them in this part of the podcast. I don't think we'll do it every week when we have guests on. That might be tough to do, listener questions, just given the flow of things. But when we don't have guests on, that would be something we would add to the conversation. So we'll get to that in a little bit. That sounds like a good idea, right?
Absolutely. And if you can't remember the email address, you can always just go to economy.com, and there's a link to the podcast there. There's also some of our content. Some of our listeners have asked for follow-ups or articles. You can just go there, and oftentimes you'll find articles that are related to what we're talking about. So.
Yeah, the other thing, I haven't begged for reviews in a while. How come people give us a review? That's helpful, good or bad. That's the feedback is important. So please feel free to do that as well. You can do that on Spotify and Apple podcast, whatever, you can provide a review, and that would be good to have as well. Okay, let's get down to business, the 2023 economic outlook. And I thought we just go, get to the meat of the matter. And I'll ask, what is because all the debate is here is, and it has been on this podcast for some time, and in the media and economic circles, is, are we going into recession in 2023? And just to level set, a recession would be as defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Business Cycle Dating Committee, a group of academic economists that meet regularly and identify the start and end dates of recessions. And they look at a wide range of data, plethora of data, everything from GDP, jobs, industrial production, incomes, retail, sales, the whole shoot match. And then based on their judgment as to whether the economy is experiencing a broad-based across lots of different industries decline in economic activity that's persistent, not just for a few months, but for a few quarters, that's a recession, and they would define it. Now, unfortunately, unlikely if we had a recession in 2023, they would determine that in 2023. It takes a while to get all the data, revisions to come in, and the dust to settle, and then they ultimately will tell us. So this may not be ultimately settled into 2024, but when they opine, but barring that kind of practical issue, that's the recession. So with that as backdrop, Cris, what is the probability that the U.S. economy is going to experience a recession beginning at some point in calendar year 2023?
So I'm going to stick with my long-standing prediction of 70%. 70% chance that the MBER will declare a recession.
Do you know you are now firmly in the consensus? That is the consensus, I think. I saw a Bloomberg poll. I think it was this morning.
So it's moved up.
But it's 70%. It moved
Wow.
up, but it's 70% of economists that were surveyed by Bloomberg. And I only read the headline, so I don't know any details. Now say recession in 2023.
So they've been coming to me. I haven't been going to them.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, how does it feel to be in the consensus now?
Now I'm a little nervous.
I know. I was going to say. and it has
I like
gone
to be
up.
the outsider. But
Yeah, and it has gone up. It was, I think, the last time they did the survey, and again, I don't know when that was. I didn't read it carefully. Was 66%. So they went from 66 to 70. So, which means there are, that's presumably the middle of the distribution of responses. So there's got to be a fair number of economists that are 75, 80, 85, 90%. So a high degree of certainty.
Well, there's one outfit we know of that has declared 100%.
Yeah. Bloomberg itself, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they think for sure we're going in, which is
a bit bold.
A little hubris, but okay. Making a statement. Hear ya. Yeah. Loud and clear. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And Marisa, what is your probability of recession in 2023?
55%.
55%. Okay.
I'm going in the opposite direction of Cris. I've been coming down.
We gotta mix it up, it's good. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back a month ago, maybe two, I'm not sure.
A couple months ago, I was at around 60, 65.
65, right.
Yeah.
So you've grown a little bit more optimistic.
I have, yeah.
Okay, we'll come back and explore that in a little bit more detail. And then I'm still at 50%, 50-50, which I know everyone's saying, oh, that's just a cop out. And to some degree it is, but I do have to pick a side because I have to put pen to paper, have to produce a forecast, an explicit forecast that our clients use that's sitting in our databases that clients use, regularly. And in our baseline forecast, there's no recession. The economy's weak in 2023, slow growth, job growth comes to a standstill, unemployment starts to notch higher, but no recession in 2023. Cris, can I ask?
This is a recession, though, right? You have a 50 basis point increase in unemployment rate over a year, which has been consistent with recessions in the past, you just get up to that line under the baseline.
Oh
right?
yeah. I mean 50-50, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't argue with anyone on either side of it too strongly. I mean, I can see it going either direction here. And of course, I think the Fed,
Yeah,
with the recent meeting, FOMC meeting, where they raised interest rates another half percentage point, they put out their a summary of economic projections, so-called SEP. And I think in that forecast, they have the unemployment rate rising by more than half a point over a year.
that's right. That's right. So the implied recession, I guess, is there. But
And people read that think that because every time the unemployment rate has risen by more than half a percentage point over a period of a year, that marks the almost to the month, I think, the beginning
start.
of recessions.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right.
So if the Fed has a forecast that has the unemployment rate rising by, I don't know what it was, 7/8% by the end of 23, that would be, if history is a guide, which suggests they are now collectively, their collective wisdom is recession, although right on the edge,
Right on the that's right.
right on the edge.
Yeah. I don't think we've ever had a recession that stopped exactly, right? Got up to 50 basis points and then didn't go higher, right?
Yeah.
That's just where where it demarks
That's
the
demarcation.
start,
You
right?
keep on going. Well,
Right.
that's the recession. I mean, where unemployment. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So,
Let me ask you this, Chris, just because this is a discussion we've been having internally.
yeah.
How would you describe the baseline? I mean, in a typical time, you have this distribution of possible economic outcomes, right? And the baseline, the easy way to say it is it's in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. There's an equal probability things are going to be worse than the baseline, and that would include recession scenarios and some pretty dark scenarios. And there's an equal probability things could be better than the baseline.
Yeah.
That becomes a little more complicated to say when the economy's at full employment, right? When because at that point you can't push unemployment any lower without generating inflation and ultimately higher rates and a recession. So it gets a little more complicated, but generally that's the way we think about it. In the current context, where the distribution, it's not normal, it's not a normal bell-shaped kind of distribution. Obviously, the risks are skewed. When I say 50-50, the risks are definitely skewed to the downside here. So how would you characterize the baseline in the current context?
So I'd say our baseline has a growth recession. I think, I know people don't really like that term. It's a little squishy term, but I can't come up with anything better. It's right on the edge between a growth recession and a very mild recession, right? So that's how I would characterize it broadly. I also would point out, though, that we're talking about the aggregate, right? We're talking about a broad-based type of description here, but there clearly are parts of this forecast that are very dark when it comes to, say, the housing market, right? There are parts of the economy that are deeply in recession, even with this overall skirting of the recession definitions. So I think the overall definition is interesting, but the components, I think, are even more interesting to different people with different interests, different perspectives, different places where they participate in the economy. So I wouldn't just look at the overall definition and stop there. I'd want to go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in our baseline forecast, no recession forecast, growth comes to a standstill. GDP growth, I think, Q4 to Q4 of 2022 to Q4 of 23 is less than 1%, so well below the economy's 2% potential.
Yeah.
Job growth slows to a trickle. We have some months that are pretty close to zero, maybe slightly positive. And in that kind of environment, that does mean parts of the economy are in recession, right? By definition.
Right.
If the aggregate economy is traveling close to zero in terms of growth, something's got to be falling, and that's housing obviously would be a case in point. Anything housing related, mortgage finance, that would be struggling. Big parts of manufacturing are, I think, if not in recession, pretty close. I guess the exception might be the vehicle industry, just because there's so much pent up demand there. We may not, as supply chains ease and the vehicle industry can get more cars to sell, they'll sell them. But manufacturing is in recession. The transportation sector. Do you see Federal Express?
Yeah.
They downgraded their expectations for profitability and going to engage in more cost cutting. Their CEO thinks we're going into a worldwide recession, and no doubt for him that FedEx is in recession, right? Because they this time last year were shipping lots of stuff because people were still buying goods, and now they're not, and they're struggling. So transportation, distribution, any other sectors, even in the baseline, no recession scenario where we'd see what sectors would be down? I think those are the most notable.
I would say construction broadly. If you think about commercial real estate, I don't know if you include that in your.
Sure. No, yeah.
But
Commercial real
clearly,
estate.
right,
Yep.
because we also have the structural issues that are catching up with us as well in terms of office usage, right? So I think in 2023, we'll start to see some reckoning in terms of office prices really revealing the underlying value or lack of value as firms are refinancing and also trying to understand or plan for future investments. So I'd say construction, probably the financial industry is going to suffer here as well, right? If there is a pullback in credit and if we are starting to see some additional losses here, there's certainly weakness, maybe not a full-blown recession for finance, but limited growth at minimum, right?
Right. Any others, Marisa? Any other sectors?
That's a lot.
Yeah.
That is a lot.
That's a lot of interest rate sensitive segments of the economy. I mean, the stuff that continues to do really well is education, healthcare, and I don't think we're expecting much of a slowdown there. So yeah, no, I think you covered it all.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, if we're getting barely any job growth on a month-to-month or quarter-to-quarter basis, that means there are industries that are outright losing jobs, right? And I think you're right that it's going to be the interest rate sensitive parts of the economy. I mean, we're already starting to see that. Tech, we're seeing now.
Oh, tech's the other one, right?
Tech,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Companies that need to finance, right, large investments, and that's becoming more difficult in a high interest rate environment. So expect that to continue if the Fed keeps raising rates into next year.
Yeah. Okay.
And then anything discretionary, right? Travel, tourism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not in the baseline, I would say. I mean, I think that would, if you get into a full-blown recession.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm thinking
This is your
thinking of my
forecast
recession
now. Your recession.
That's my forecast.
Yeah. I mean, if we're skirting along bottom, that means there's a fair number of sectors that are growing and doing reasonably okay. And I think in that discretionary might hold up okay. It's not going to be gangbusters, but okay, just given all the pent up demand for travel and restaurants and ball games and that kind of thing.
And definitely at the higher end, right?
At the higher end, anything catering to high income households, right? Where there's resources, financial resources. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's go back to the 70% and the 55%, and then I'll throw in my 3 cents as well. That 70% is an important threshold because in our forecasting, in our work, we've mentioned this a number of times before in the podcast. For us to make a change like this one, a big change in our forecast from no recession to an outright recession, and maybe we should talk a little bit about what outright recession means in terms of numbers, but typically, but that's a pretty big change, right? I mean, maybe I'll do it now. In the current context, if we suffered the typical recession, say go look at the 12 recessions since World War II, look at the average length, look at the average decline in GDP, peak to trough, look at what happens to jobs and unemployment. The typical recession lasts 10 months. GDP falls almost 3% peak to trough. In the current context, meaning the current size of the labor force, we'd lose almost 4 million jobs, probably 4 million. And so that's a lot of jobs. You'd see months where you're down 400,000 jobs potentially, something like that. That's a big difference from that in our baseline of 0. Unemployment would go to 6%. Now, it doesn't mean the recession that's dead ahead of us is going to be typical. It could be less severe, and we should talk about that as well. But that gives context. It's a big deal to go from no recession to recession. And for us to make that change in our forecast, our baseline forecast, and again, we do all kinds of scenarios and downside scenarios. So we've got that covered. But for the baseline, the headline forecast, the kind of sort of the middle of the distribution, the modal forecast, we have to have a very high conviction of that. That means, to put a number on it, over a 2/3 probability that that's going to happen. So you say 70%. That's more than 2/3. So you are now chief economist and you're running the ship, and you're saying we got to put a recession in our forecast. That's what you're saying with the 70%. So that's an important number. Okay, given that, characterize that recession for me. How long? How deep? When? Exactly, because again, you have to put pen to paper. You can't be waving your hand and say, "Oh yeah, sometime in 2023 we'll see things go bad." Now you could do that, but you also have to say, "Here's the numbers. These are the numbers." So give us the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's very important to characterize that average distribution. I'm advocating for something milder than that average, right? So in terms of what this recession looks like, my leading hypothesis is that it is caused by the tightening that we've experienced in the economy, that does catch up with us in 2023, causes consumers and businesses to pull back, losses on credit cards and other credit instruments start to rise, and that leads to the actual recession, the broader recession. So I'm thinking of something around Q3 in terms of a start. The duration will be shorter than that 10-month average you mentioned, right? So I don't think it'll last that long, for some of the positive aspects that I'm sure we'll get into in terms of the strength of consumer balance sheets and business balance sheets fundamentally, right? So there are some reasons why this wouldn't last a particularly long time. And then the depth, I don't see it as being particularly deep either. So in terms of job losses, I could see 1 million or 2 million lost jobs, which on the surface is still devastating, right? That's still a lot of people losing work, but it's not the typical recession. For that, one reason why I'm not at something higher than 70% is really due to that job market figure, right? If I'm only suggesting 1 million or 2 million job losses, there's a chance that MBER comes along, the committee you mentioned, and says, well, that's not broad enough, or that's not pervasive, that's not deep enough to really define a recession. So that's why I vacillate a little bit, because I think we'll be right on the edge of what they might consider a recession. But at the end of the day, I think they will, because I do expect it to be fairly broad-based here.
So the recession, second half of 2023, kind of less severe than the typical, maybe half the length.
Let's call it half the length.
So
half
basically the second half of the 23 and half the severity, if you measure it in terms of jobs.
Right.
And the unemployment rate doesn't go to 6, it might go to 5.
5.25, something like that.
Yeah, 5.25. Okay.
And you get negative quarters of GDP growth in your scenario, Cris?
You do, but they're not very deep, right?
Barely negative.
And the recession, as you described it, is not caused by any additional shocks or mistakes, or it's baked in the cake, so to speak. That's what it felt like you just said, that given what the Fed has done already, even if the Fed stopped today raising interest rates, so they raised rates 0.5 point when they met a week or two ago, the funds rate target, which was at 0 at the start of 2022, is now 4.25% to 4.5%. Given that increase in rates, and of course they're articulating more rate increases to come.
Yeah.
And the expectation in the marketplace, and it's consistent with our baseline, is another 0.5 point to put the funds rate target, the so-called terminal rate, the highest the rate we're going to get in the cycle, at 4.75 to 5. You're saying even if they don't do that, or maybe you're saying if
No.
they do that.
I'm assuming they do that.
Oh, okay. So
right?
they follow
So-
through and they get to 5.
Yeah.
That's the end of the story in terms of the rate increases. And then that's enough. The die is cast at that point.
That's right. Then it takes, quarter or so for that to fully be digested. And that's what causes or leads to the last straw, if you will.
Right. Right. And it doesn't take anything else happening. Oil prices don't have to go up. The pandemic doesn't have to come back. China doesn't have to shut down again. I'm making stuff up, obviously that are top of mind, but
no, if those things, that's right. I think that the scenario I've described here is really, it can be
endogenous. It's sort of
realized,
endogenous, sort of
correct.
already built in. It's
Yeah.
baked in the cake.
If we get some of those other factors, then it argues for a deeper, more severe recession, right? Or maybe faster even, right? Those would be.
In fact, I would go back to the Fed. The market is already expecting 5. That's already built into financial conditions, and that's already the effects of that are already coursing through the economy already. So even if they go to 5 and stay there, that effectively is already being brought into the marketplace and affecting the economy. They don't.
It hasn't been fully realized.
Yeah.
Right? So banks are certainly tightening their standards, right? Reacting, anticipating that path, but it won't until business really have to go refinance their loans, or households really have to pay their bills. The real effects on the economy won't appear, right?
Yeah.
That's a part of the lag here.
Yeah. By the way, this is an adjustment in the way you describe things, right? Because we had a bit of I'd say it's a kind of an economist tiff back a few weeks ago around what would cause the recession. And you kind of went back on, there's going to be some other things that go wrong. And because the economy is so fragile, that would be enough to push us in. But what I'm hearing you now say is we don't even need that. It's kind of baked. It's happening. Regardless of whatever happens out there, even everything sticks to script, there's no shocks, no nothing. We're going in. That's what I hear.
Yes. Although the caveat here is how I've described the severity, right? So again, those other shocks would.
Yeah.
Then I think there's no question. If we get some other shock here, then I think there's no real question for NBER, right?
Well, it depends on the shock, obviously. I mean, no one would argue with that. I mean, I wouldn't argue with that, right?
But then we're getting 3-4 million job losses. Then I think there's no debate, right? the NBER would come in and say, yes, that is a recession, right? Broad-based. I think there's no real question there. And what I've described today, this milder version, right? That's where I think there's that room for discussion or debate.
Okay. I go on a little. No, I don't think I'm going on a limb here. If we lose 1 to 2 million jobs, I'd be shocked if the NBER doesn't, because if you lose 1-2 million jobs, unemployment that's closing in on 5. I would be pretty surprised if they don't label that a recession. I'd be pretty surprised. No.
Yeah, but if it's concentrated, even then you can argue, well, if it's all in the tech sector or just in certain areas and just in housing.
Boy, but 1.2 million, you're losing jobs in lots of places. I think.
Yeah, that doesn't typically happen.
Yeah,
right?
it doesn't typically.
It doesn't typically happen, right?
Yeah. So okay. All right. Okay. You see, somehow I feel like he's finding a way out.
No.
He's trying to. I haven't quite figured it out yet, but he's trying to find a way out of this thing.
No.
I hear you though.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll make the dollar bet at the end, and
I hate these dollar bets. I do lose the dollar bets. That's why I haven't made a dollar bet on this one, because I always lose the dollar bets. I'm too cavalier with a dollar. Make it 1 million.
Oh.
And then we're gonna really know.
We'll know.
Of course, no one's gonna pay that. Then we'll know. So Marisa, you're at 55%. So you would hold on to the baseline. You would not change the baseline.
Yeah. So I think Cris is on one edge of the baseline and I'm on the opposite edge. So I think that we're going to avoid this, that I agree. So obviously financial market conditions are tightening, but I think the Fed has done a good job of transmitting this well in advance. They may have been on the late side starting to raise rates, but at the end of 21, they telegraphed that they were going to go from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening. They've been talking quite a bit. I think market expectations have been very well anchored through most of this whole thing, except with like a blip during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think, as you said, 2, maybe 3 more rate hikes are baked in now to market expectations. And the Fed has, at their last meeting with their dot plots, right, they've pretty much said we're expecting a terminal Fed funds rate now of just over 5%. I think that that's been so far well tolerated by financial markets. Sure, things are tightening. We do see tightening in lending standards for things like credit cards, a little bit for autos, mortgages, a tiny bit. Interest rate sensitive segments of the economy are slowing. But I do think households have maybe never been in a better position than they are now coming into this in terms of excess saving that they have. The labor market has held up. Sure, there's evidence that it's cooling off, but so far we see that in employers pulling back on hiring or canceling open job positions, but not really laying people off, with the exception of, these announcements in the tech sector, right, that have made headlines, but we're not really seeing that in other parts of the economy. And business balance sheets are also very, very healthy. Households are on the whole locked into fixed rate, low interest rate loans and mortgages. So if you're going to see pullback among households, it might be in things like, credit cards, right? Things that are variable rate and can change over time. And maybe we'll see some pullback in spending there. But it just feels like, my assumption is that all the things that'll happen that Cris just laid out will happen, but on the other side, we'll get through it without a recession. I think the job market's going to slow. I think job openings are going to come down. We're already seeing that, but I don't think there's going to be massive layoffs throughout the economy.
Yeah. So that all makes sense to me. And that's kind of sort of how I think about it when I'm still at 50%, that I just don't see the kind of underlying weaknesses in the economy that typically prevail before recession. And the thing that would suggest that doesn't matter at all, that don't worry about the fundamentals, is if inflation remained more persistent and the Fed had to raise rates more than what we're expecting, and what markets are expecting. And I don't, at this point, given the better inflation statistics, I'm increasingly confident that a 5% funds rate target is going to be sufficient to slow things down so that, inflation comes in a reasonably orderly way, and that's not going to be the problem. And if you ask me, Mark, if you're wrong, what would it take for you to think that a recession is going to occur? I would say that inflation is just going to be more persistent than anticipated. But I feel increasingly more confident that inflation is going to come in, and we can talk about that. But the fundamentals are pretty darn good. And you mentioned consumers; they're in pretty good financial health. Again, we should all say we're painting with a broad brush here. I mean, there's a lot of things underneath that. I mean, low income households are struggling, but middle income and particularly high income households are doing just fine. Thank you. They've got plenty of cash sitting in their checking accounts built up during the pandemic, and they're using that. Businesses are in good shape. Debt to GDP is stable. Businesses have done a great job locking in the low rates like households have. The financial system feels like it's pretty good. I mean, there have been some cracks here and there. The biggest one was overseas in the UK with their pension plan, but that was a foot fault of a mistaken policy. And banking system is highly capitalized, very liquid post financial crisis. Just feels like the system's in a good spot. You talked about real estate markets. I mean, housing is underbuilt. It's not. Vacancy rates are pretty close to record lows, at least in the home ownership market. Office, but that's small in the grand scheme of things. I don't think that, and it's not like it's not like vacancy rates are high in office because of construction. It's just because of the shift in preferences to remote work. and lack decline. And state and local governments are flush. They raked in a lot of tax revenue and they got a boatload of cash from the American Rescue Plan that they can spend out through 2026. And then here's the other thing. Fiscal policy, federal fiscal policy, hard to believe this, but it was a major headwind to growth in 2022, right? Because we had all that juice with all the support during the pandemic, with ending with the American Rescue Plan in March of 21. That provided tremendous fiscal tailwinds in growth in 2022. But in 2021, but now by the second half of 2022, that's turned into a bit of a headwind, and that's going to be now increasingly turning back into a bit of a tailwind as the other pieces of legislation passed in the Biden administration are going to kick in. The most obvious being the infrastructure bill. That's going to start adding to growth in the second half of 23, going into 2024, just when you think the recession is going to hit, Chris. So
not a lot though, right?
Not a lot, but I'm just
backloaded.
But on the
yeah.
mark, that's in my litany of reasons.
I hear you.
My litany of reasons.
I hear you.
So, I look at those things and I say, really, this doesn't feel like the fodder is in place for an economic downturn. So, Marisa, back to you. I mean, did I miss anything in that litany?
I just want to say two more things that I thought of while you were talking. One, on the housing market, we've been saying the housing market's in recession, but is from a household perspective and a wealth effect perspective, really, unless you bought a house and probably overpaid for it in 2020 or 2021, even unlike in the financial crisis, even if house prices fell 10%, for most people, that's still going to put them above board on what they owe on their home, right? So if you bought a house in 2018, 2019, and you lose 5 to 10% of value in that house in most of the major housing markets in this country, you're still up from where you started because house price increases were so astronomical. So unless you bought a house very recently, I think the wealth effect here is not as much of a concern to me in terms of housing.
Okay, so just so listeners understand where you're coming from, because you kind of went back, and
I did go back,
yeah. And what you're saying now is, okay, one reason why you might be nervous about a recession is what's going on in housing. Housing's getting crushed because of the run up in mortgage rates and the lack of affordability. House prices now are rolling over and starting to come in. And the concern is, well, with people losing housing wealth, that the so-called wealth effect will affect their spending and savings decisions. And that is a reason to be concerned. And you're saying, well, not so much. That's the point of what you're just saying right now.
Yeah, I'm saying for the majority of households, even if the value of my house falls 5%, I'm still in a pretty good position.
Okay. Now, before we go on to your second point,
Chris,
I heard you said you had 2 points. Chris wants to say something.
He wants to say something about housing for sure.
Housing, yeah. By the way, he is the expert, Marisa. I'm just saying you are now in his territory.
I've picked the wrong fight. Yeah.
No, all good. Okay. I think you're right in terms of the chances of default, right? People are still in a positive equity position. There's no reason to default. They've locked in these low mortgage rates. They have to live somewhere. But I think there is still a wealth effect there. And if in terms of savings, or additional savings versus spending, right? If I was counting on that appreciation for my retirement, I was cutting back on my saving. Now that has to reverse, and I have to start saving again to build up or replace that loss of housing wealth. So I do think that psychological effect is also at play here in terms of where we go and how the recession play out.
I think that's a whole nother podcast, to tell you the truth. I've got so many things I'd like to say about that on the housing wealth effects, but that's definitely a podcast. We could get someone to come in. Yeah, definitely a podcast. What's the second thing you were going to say, Marisa?
The other thing I was going to say is the reason I'm at 55 and not at 50 with you, why I've been a little bit higher, is just that I do think we're in a fragile position. And I do think there is a chance that we get some sort of exogenous shock or something happens with supply chains. The COVID situation in China is really bad now. The more I read about it, the more I'm nervous about something emanating from China to really slow down the global economy more than we're expecting. And I just think if there's something like that happens, if the situation in Ukraine gets worse, Russia does something, off the grid here, I just think it's going to be and I think we all agree, it would be very difficult for the US economy to avoid a recession in that case. And I guess I'm just a little bit more pessimistic about the possibility of something happening in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I'm actually sympathetic to that argument. And I like, that's reasonable to be at 55% with that argument. It's hard to have that argument and be over 66% and change your baseline. Because once you change your baseline, then you got to define exactly what that shock is. And this is back to that tiff that Cris and I had back. Listener, you should go back and listen to that. That was a pretty, I'd say for us, a heated exchange. On this issue, that's hard to build in, but I'm sympathetic, to that argument. So Cris, back to you.
Yeah.
What would it take? What would have to happen for your probabilities to fall from 70 back below that 66, and let's say all the way back to 50, something like that, meaningfully lower? Let's put it that way, from the 70% that you have today. Your baseline would go back to no recession.
Yeah, I'd say that certainly those global risks, right? If we got an upside shock from one of them, that would certainly reduce the odds of a U.S. recession considerably. So if there was some type of ceasefire or resolution of the war in Ukraine, right, that certainly would help energy markets, would help Europe, would help Asia, and would help the U.S. by extension in terms of stabilizing energy prices, getting a little bit more certainty going forward. I agree with you, Marisa. I think that there's a lot of concern around the Chinese economy right now. So any type of resolution there in terms of COVID, right? My plan is to give all the mRNA vaccines we can to China, get that population vaccinated as quickly as possible. I think that would be a great outcome of not only for the Chinese economy, but for the globe. So that would certainly getting COVID under control in China would be a significant upside risk, would help the supply chains, it would help their domestic demand. It would certainly help to cool some of the social unrest that they're experiencing as well. So I see that as a positive. And I do remain quite concerned about Europe. I think I've said this in the past in terms of energy related to Ukraine, but even more broadly, I think they'll get through this winter just fine. But as we get into the spring and summer and they're looking to replenish their gas stocks, that's a downside risk. If there is accelerated movement in terms of LNG or other types of fonts of energy into the European economy, I think that could certainly be a positive factor as well. That could also help, again, bringing those energy prices down, bringing inflation down faster, I guess, is at the root of this. That those would be all upside risks I could see here.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. You're saying you need a positive shock for it to come, for your probabilities to come back in. It's not something endogenously determined in the economy that will allow. Like if I told you inflation is going to moderate more quickly at this point than is anticipated by most forecasters, and just to level set there, consumer price inflation year over year is about 7%. I think it's 7.1 to be precise in November. The peak was about 9 in June of this year, 2022. We've got it coming down to, probably half of what it is today by the end of 23, say 3.5% ish. And then by mid 2024, it's back within spitting distance of the Federal Reserve's inflation target, which on CPI, consumer price inflation, by our calculations, probably about 2.5%. If inflation came in faster than that, not related to a positive supply shock like end of Russian aggression, oil prices come in, but it's just coming in faster. It just comes in. It's easier to get service price inflation down than is the case right now.
Okay, so wages moderate.
Yeah, wages moderate. Yeah, the wages aren't as sticky as people think. That it was all inflation expectations driven with oil prices and gas prices down, inflation expectations come in, wage growth comes in, service price inflation moderates, and we're back to the Fed's target by, let's say, the end of 2023 going into 2024. You're saying at this point, doesn't matter, that we're going in. That's not enough to, it
Well,
has to be some kind of positive shock.
I mean, I guess you're saying if my behavioral assumptions are wrong here, that inflation comes in a lot faster than what I'm anticipating. Yeah, that would be a cause for me to reevaluate and lower the recession probabilities, right?
But it really shouldn't, though, right? Right, because you're saying the 5%. I'm getting to 5% on the funds rate target by presumably in the next few months. That's the end of the story, and we're going into recession by the second half of the year. It doesn't feel like there's much that can save the day here, other than some kind of positive shock, something that goes right for us as opposed to wrong. It's not something. The die. I guess the point I'm trying to make is the forecast you're giving. It feels like you're saying the die is cast unless there's some major event that saves the day here.
Yeah, but I'm presuming a certain path for inflation, right? I'm presuming a number of effects here. I could be wrong. I want to be humble, right? I could be wrong about that. Maybe inflation, to your point, maybe it comes in a lot faster than what I'm anticipating, and therefore the Fed doesn't need to go to 5%. And in fact, they can start cutting at the end of the year and give support to the economy, right? Just at a time when I'm thinking it's going to be particularly weak. So that would certainly be an upside risk as well, that I'm not reading the tea leaves properly, or there's some other adjustments that businesses and households make behaviorally that bring in inflation at a much faster pace.
Yeah,
maybe there's more exploration of oil in the U.S., right? More fracking, whatever it is. All right, so that supports energy prices coming in faster.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
well, for me, the thing that would drive my odds up, the recession probability is up, and for us to change our forecast, abstracting from the negative shocks, I agree that the probability that's high and we may go into recession. That's why I'm not arguing. I wouldn't argue strongly with anyone who says we're going into recession. I just can't build that into a baseline forecast. I don't know how to do that in a reasonable way at this point. So the thing that would make me ultimately change the forecast to have recession in it would be the most likely inflation would just have to be more persistent than I'm anticipating, and that the Fed would have to continue to raise rates, that they take it to 5, they look around, they see, oh my goodness, inflation's not coming in, wage growth is not moderating, job growth is not slowing sufficiently to get wage growth moving south. Also, you throw in, if inflation expectations start rising again, then I have no choice here. I'm for me, a necessary condition for a well-functioning economy is, it's not sufficient, but a necessary condition is low and stable inflation. So I'm going to 5.5. I may even go to 6. I may go to 6.5, and that will break the economy at some point, and we'll go into recession. So for me, that's what it would take, to change that. We get into next year, and the inflation statistics just don't look good. We're not getting like we got last month, a couple tenths of a percent. By the way, just throwing it out there, the December CPI report that we're going to get, that's going to look primo. That's going to look really good. Another good CPI numbers coming, and that should help. But if you get in early next year and we start getting 0.3, 0.4 on core, 0.5, I think, at that point, I'd say I've got to pack it in. The funds rate's going higher, and we're going into recession by the end of 23, going into 24.
And you're really pointing to wage growth as a major causal factor.
Only because that's what the Fed's most focused on. I mean, by the way, that's another podcast. I'm not sure why we're so focused on that. I mean, anyway, I don't want to go down that path, but we should talk about that. But the Fed is focused on. That's the one thing they can control, or at least they think they can control.
Right.
Yeah, so they're focused on that. And if they can't get wage growth down, they'll keep pushing rates up. If they keep pushing rates up, by definition, at some point, we're going into recession. It's just going to happen. I mean, at some point, the rates are going to be too high for too long, and something's going to break, and we're going in.
So if we're seeing that still in February, March, right, elevated 4.5%, 5% wage growth, then you would contemplate? putting
Yeah,
in a
I mean,
recession, et cetera?
first principle is the inflation statistics. I mean,
Okay.
that's the most
Yeah, of
important.
course.
If inflation statistics are bad, it doesn't matter. If the inflation statistics
matter
are
the
good,
source.
then I go take a look at the wage growth, and if that feels like it's rolled over and coming in, then I feel good about my forecast, the baseline forecast. If if it's not coming in, then I'm thinking, we're gonna have a problem. The problem with wage growth, the reason why I'm hesitating there is the data sucks. It's just not good. It's very difficult to, at least the timely data, right?
Yeah.
The average hourly earnings you get every month, it's very hard to interpret. Gets revised. It's seasonal adjustment issues, timing of the survey, composition. It's a mess.
Yeah.
The employment cost index, which I do trust, and the only thing I really trust, that comes out quarterly with a long lag. So you're saying if it comes into February, March, I'm saying, well, I'm not going to get that data for Q1 until what, May, something like that. So, it's hard to know exactly when, I would change in my mind.
So that's part of the crux of my thesis then in terms of the Fed, right? And whether it's, I hate to use the word mistake because they're just reacting to the data that they have, but that certainly could be a condition for them to continue raising or not to cut because of those long lags in the reliable data, right? They only have the hourly earnings, so that's the best they can do when they're making their decision. Right?
Okay, that's a great segue into the listener questions. So,
okay,
new feature of Inside Economics. We're going to take a few questions, and again, strongly encourage listeners to fire away. Help Economy. That's one word. Help Economy at Moody's.com, or go to economy.com, the website, and there's a place for you to put your questions in there. Or you know how to get us. Just send an email.
Twitter, LinkedIn,
whatever. Twitter at Mark Zandy. I'm just saying at Mark Zandy.
Oh, it's been a while.
It's been a while
since
I've hawked that Twitter. What do they call it? Twitter handle. Is that a Twitter handle? I think it's Twitter handle. Yeah. I don't think it's fashionable though to be doing that these days.
I was going to say, are you backing off the Twitter promotion?
I'm not really following this very carefully. I probably should. Okay. First question. How would you rate the Federal Reserve's conduct of monetary policy? Give me a letter grade. That is from a listener. And Marisa, I'll start with you. How would you rate the Fed's managing conduct in terms of managing policy?
We're talking over the past.
You define it. That's the question.
Yeah.
So you define it. However you want to answer it.
B-.
Okay. So and I'm sure the Fed will not take that as an answer. They will want to know why.
They want my notes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. B-. Why not a B? Why not a C+?
I think they started too late. I think the reaction on monetary policy was too late. And I worry that it was late enough that it's going to be difficult for them to truly get inflation under control in the time frame that they want to. Now, it looks like that's happening. I mean, certainly looks like the inflation data are rolling over. But that doesn't mean that it's not happening too late, just based on the way financial markets are reading it, or households are reading it, or businesses are reading it, talking about wage growth and setting wages are very sticky, setting employee wages for the next year. Once you give somebody a raise, you can't really take it back, right? So I think they've done well in the communication of what they've done over the past year, but I just worry that they got started too late.
So you're saying, back to the start of 2022, the funds rate target was still at the zero lower bound, that they were still buying bonds, QEing, quantitative easing, and at that same point in time, given inflation, given how the job market was performing, given financial conditions, the value of the dollar, all the things they look at for gauging the appropriate stance of monetary policy, they should have been raising interest rates much sooner than they actually did. That's what you're saying. And therefore, that can't be an A. It can't even be a solid B. That's a B- because of that mistake.
I mean, granted, in retrospect, we'll see how they did.
Well, what if I
But-
push back a little bit and said, well, a little, and I don't want to be a defender here.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they would say, and I think with some legitimacy, hey, did you know about the Russian invasion of Ukraine? You know, that didn't happen until February of last year. And, you know, moreover, and that's when inflation expectations really took off. It's when Russia invaded and oil prices spiked and gasoline went north and food prices started to rise because of higher diesel costs. And you saw this untethering of inflation expectations. And that's what ultimately, that's in their reaction function. That's one of the criteria they look at. And they said, oh gosh, now we got to go but that wasn't the case until Russia actually invaded. You know, you could see oil prices started trending higher back in December of last year when it started to go on the radar screen. But it wasn't really on the radar screen in any effective way until then. Can I get a B, please? No.
Yeah, but there was evidence even before the invasion that there were inflation issues rearing their head, right? Both in energy markets and caused by supply chains. They knew the job market was really strong. They knew households had all this excess saving from the pandemic. They were at zero, right? I mean, they could have started slowly inching up, I think, prior to the invasion. Again, this is all Monday morning quarterbacking here. You're right. I mean, certainly if you look at market inflation expectations, they didn't really pop up above that Fed target until the invasion and the acute spike in oil prices. And then the Fed started reacting. But I still think they could have, they should have anticipated some uptick in inflation given what was going on even before that.
Okay. All right. B minus. Chris, what's your grade?
So I give them a B plus on the Fed funds rate policy, but I give them a D on the
Ooh.
quantitative easing.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So overall, what is that? C plus maybe?
C plus. Oh, explain, please.
Yeah. So I think we give them a hard time in terms of the Fed funds, right? Yeah, the timing you mentioned. Also, if we look back, there was unemployment was still high, relatively high. It was coming down, but still relatively high in 2021. So what are we talking about in terms of when exactly they would have started? Are we, instead of starting in, what was it, March, they would have started in January or
January.
December? I mean, it's a few months. It doesn't
Yep.
really change the contours all that much, I would argue. And there was enough uncertainty that I can't really fault them for those policies, but I do fault them for not ending the quantitative easing sooner. And certainly the MBS purchases went on far too long, and I think stoked the housing market and caused house prices to rise even further than necessary throughout this period. And that, I think, does contribute to the inflation where you're still experiencing now those rent increases, those house price increases in the CPI. So I think that was bad policy. I don't see why that they felt the need to continue those policies.
Yeah, I mean,
Fed funds rate, I think, again, there's enough uncertainty.
Just a little pushback there, just a little
Yeah.
bit. I mean, it would have been difficult, not impossible, but a little difficult to stop the QE without raising the funds rate at the same time. I mean, I think the framework for the shift in policy was, they could roughly have to happen. They should happen at the same time. Maybe I've got that wrong, but it would have just been a little tricky for them to say, "Oh, I'm gonna." Well, maybe you're right.
It would have been tapering.
Yeah,
much
maybe
longer. It
you're
doesn't
right.
have to go
Yeah.
to zero. I mean, in fact, it would have been beneficial to ease into it with more a longer horizon. But
yeah,
and I think that already sends the signal, right? That's you're telling the
I'm
market,
coming.
look, I'm coming, right?
Party's
I'm on the
ending.
case here,
right.
Especially given what we were seeing in the housing market, right? To Marisa's point, there was data there. There was no lag, right? We saw prices going up at double-digit rates.
Yeah. Well, I'd give them a solid B. Can't get an A because you didn't get it right. I mean, your fault, not your fault. Hard to know. I'm sympathetic to the argument that this was, the Russian invasion wasn't on the radar screen. Therefore, how could I have gotten this right? Fog of data, lag
Right.
data, all those things that, or make it difficult to conduct policy. But at the end of the day, how you're not going to get an A unless you get it right. I mean, it's just not,
Yeah.
and you didn't get it right. You got it wrong. But I can't see getting them anything less than a B because so much was out of their control. And policy 101 says if there's a lot of uncertainty, and at the time there was hard to remember, but the pandemic was
Yeah.
still a big deal. Omicron was still scary. We were still worried about that. And we still are worried about it. We're still talking about it, but back then, still top of mind. Zandy family didn't have Zandy Christmas, where we bring in all my brothers and sisters last Christmas. Hard to believe because we were fearful of everyone getting sick. In fact, some of us had gotten sick, right before Christmas. So policy 101 says if there's a lot of uncertainty, err on the side of doing too much, not too little, to support the economy. And I think they were following the textbook, the policy policy conduct, monetary conduct. Well, what do I want to say? The conduct of monetary policy textbook or whatever it is, they were following it. So now having said that, I'm not sure what grade I'd give them for the conduct of policy right now. I'm my sense is that if I were them, I'd be using two things to kind of gauge the appropriateness of policy. One is inflation expectations. The second is the shape of the curve. Now, I wouldn't be a slave to it, but I would be thinking about it and using it. And if inflation expectations are, and I would use the bond market expectations, the 1 year, 5 year forward. I look at them all, but that's the one I would be most focused on because that's the one I can control most clearly. If that's above 2.5%, probably closer to 3%, then I'd say, okay, I got to keep raising interest rates here, and I got to keep signaling to markets I'm going to raise rates. I got to keep financial conditions tight. I got to get those inflation expectations down. But right now, the bond market inflation expectations, no matter how you measure it, is right on the Fed's target. I mean, I just looked at 1 year, 5 year forwards. That comes out of inflation protected securities and swaps, 2.25%. I think the 5 year forward, 2.25%. The 5 year break evens, I think they're less than that. I think they're 2. And see, this is CPI inflation. So that says I don't know that I need to be overly worried. I don't need to be hawkish. I don't need to be sending signals. I'm in a pretty good spot. I don't want to give people a sense that I'm not going to go to 5. I told people I'm going to 5, and that's embedded in those inflation expectations. But I don't think I need to do any more than that. And I'm also now starting to err on the side of doing too much. Going back to the yield curve, when the curve gets as inverted as it is, that goes to policy. The bond market is saying, oh, the Fed's really jacking up interest rates, and at some point that's going to really weaken the economy. In the case of a curve inversion, historically, that's a recession. So that'd be a signal that, hey guys, that's a little too much. First thing I look at is inflation expectations. Whatever that says, I'm going to do. But if they're anchored, then I'm going to look at the yield curve, and then I'm going to say, okay, that should be the end of the story. So I think if they go to 5 and stay there, fine. But if they keep on going, I'll get pretty annoyed at that, because I think they're at their point, they're doing too much. So I for their policy up to this date and point, I give them a B. Still not clear, what their ultimate grade will be. But I'd say I'm a little nervous about that at this point. Okay, we just covered a lot of ground. We got a bunch of other questions. I'll ask one more, and then we'll call it a podcast. And that is around the value of the dollar. As you know, the dollar has been strong throughout much of the pandemic, flight to quality. And the Fed, of course, in 2022 has been raising interest rates a lot faster than other central banks. Because of the higher rates here compared to the rest of the world, money's been flowing in and the dollar's been strong. I think if you go back a couple months ago, maybe it's a month ago, the dollar was at its peak. So, at one point it was pretty close to parity with the pound. It was beyond parity against the euro. It was closing in on 150 to the yen. I think it was 150 to the yen. It was strong against the Chinese currency. It's come in now more recently. You might have seen in the last couple of days, the Bank of Japan announced a shift in their policy around the yield curve control. And that's called that's somewhat of a tightening in policy. So we've seen the yen, appreciate a bit in value. So the dollar's off its peaks, but still very, very high. The question is, where is the dollar headed, broadly speaking? Up, down, all around. Where do you think it's going, Chris?
Depends on the timeline, of course. But so short term, I think it stays strong because of the relative strength of the U.S. economy compared to other parts of the world. There's still a lot of uncertainty, flight to quality. There'll be some adjustments here because all central banks are reacting to each other, but I don't see it. I don't see the dollar really losing ground for a while until we get a bit of stabilization here. So I'd say dollar remains the best bet out there and continue to have strength.
What about a year
much of
from now when
2023.
we're in recession? In your recession, we're in recession.
Well, we're
It's
in
got to be
recession.
easing at that point, presumably.
Yeah, that's right. So we're in recession, but it's again, it's all relative, right? So also the rest of the globe is in recession as well at that point. So even then, right, the dollar is weaker, but it's not. It's still relatively stronger compared to other currencies. I think it's not until after that recession and things stabilize that the dollar actually comes back in, gets closer to its equilibrium.
Right. And do you think there's any chance the U.S. loses its or reserve currency status, or even the reserve currency status is diminished? You saw this was another question about the Russian and Chinese are now trying to buy oil. I don't think it wasn't not with dollars, but maybe their own currencies. I can't.
Currency.
Yeah, their own currencies. And of course, the fact that oil in most commodities, in most goods, are traded in dollars, gives the U.S. Dollar reserve currency status, which is very important, very significant privilege, and gives us a lot of economic benefit. Do you think there's any chance that will be significantly diminished anytime in the near future?
I don't see it. And with the cryptocurrency crisis, I think it even strengthens the dollar's position even more, right? People, even consumers now, retail investors are thinking about safety of currencies. And I think the dollar remains the champion there.
Got it.
Right.
Yep. Marisa, any views on that? Do you have any strong opinions on that? Question?
I completely agree with everything he said. I mean, I feel like as an economist, we've been getting that question about the dollar as the reserve currency for years and years. And it's just still, if you look around the world, one of the least risky places. So yeah, I agree with Chris's assessment.
Yeah. I guess that's the answer. I mean, what's the alternative?
Right.
Really? Yeah. The pound? The yen? The yuan? Huh? The euro?
We could still screw it up with the debt ceiling and
well, a lot of this came, was precipitated by the decision when Russia invaded, the U.S. froze dollar reserves of Russia, and so that sent a signal that those dollars are not sacrosanct; they can be frozen. And so I think obviously that's one of the reasons why Russia and China want to get off the dollar as fast as they can. But I don't see how that happens. Yeah, it'd be very difficult. Okay, good. So what do you think of this new feature of the podcast? This listener question. It's
great.
You like it? Yeah. You do? Okay. All right. Okay. We're going to do this going forward. So listener, you're on. Give us those and try to stump us. And you should know I did not tell Cris or Marisa the questions beforehand. So these were answers. Maybe you're disappointed I didn't tell them beforehand.
Maybe we would have had better answers.
No, but I think it makes it more interesting, more spontaneous. So you get, people's true feelings, I think, if we don't let them think about it. So they got to respond. But please send in your questions. Well, hey, guys, this is the end of the podcast. I want to wish you a happy holidays, and I'll see you on the other side. Take care now.